Okay, good morning. My name is Adam Hawkins. I'm representing Group 9, which is Adam Hawkins and Braden Horde. Sorry, Braden. I don't know why I keep messing up your last name. It's good to have Braden back, though. Feeling healthy again. Excited to have him back as my partner in crime. I hope I can remember everything you wanted me to talk about today. So we went through Chapter 13 out of the DevOps Handbook, which is Architect for Low Risk Releases. And if you can sum up the chapter in one thing, it just talks about how we architect, how we build our systems around itself, can really determine how quickly we can get releases out, and you can back yourself into such a corner, you can end up killing your company. There's a couple of really cool examples that they used in the book that we'll go through today. So, all right. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is the architecture that enables productivity, testability, and safety. So these first three were through Braden, what he did, but it talks about when you build your architecture, don't build tightly. Tightly built architectures can impede workflow and the ability to make changes occur, which affects our DevOps as a whole. Loosely coupled, on the other hand, architecture as well-defined interfaces creates a far better system, high productivity, easily made changes. So what they're talking about basically is when you build things that are so interdependent, tightly built around each other, it makes it really difficult to be able to make changes, to be able to put out code because they're so interdependent upon each other. You have to make sure that every code change you make, it becomes such a tangled web that it makes it really difficult to push out changes. And we'll see that with a couple of the examples they put out in the book. So I love the poop emojis. I'm sorry, Braden. So talk about two different structures, the monoliths and the microservices. So the monolithic structure, the pros is that it's easily implementation out of the gate, easy to manage code base, resources are efficient when small. The cons are it doesn't scale well, it's poor redundancy, and it's all or nothing scheme in the model. Where the microservices-like structure, the pros, it's easy to make tweaks to large services, unit simplicity and management. Cons, there's many pieces that work together, poor latency and performance, and not cheap at first. And I thought this was interesting. At first, you would think that the monolithic was a better way to go because it's a bigger system, but then you go back to that tightly versus loosely. The problem is that with this system, it just creates a danger for your company because you're so interdependent upon that one thing. Where the microservices is lots of smaller, different architects, different structures that you would build off of. And so let's get into the first example. So they talked about Amazon, right? And so Amazon started with this monolithic structure to service the website. It became unmanageable, too tangled with dependencies across all services. And so they were unable to evolve to the point where the structure had grown itself into a corner. I think this is a beautiful example because Amazon is such a big company. You think that, oh man, it has so much potential, so much you can do, even when it started out as just a book company. But they had grown themselves and backed themselves into this corner. They were unable to make these changes. And so they learned a few things. They talk about strict service orientation, can achieve microsystems like isolation structure, limit database access to customers in order to speed up the hardware and the network. I think this one's really interesting. I have some examples of that, even in my own life I'll get into. And having teams that can innovate for customers so that more value is seen up front and creates a larger customer base. And so one of the examples that I thought of is we have a point of sale system that we currently use here at the wrecking yard that I manage. And the point of sale system is just a database. It's built over a database. And so the database has gotten so big that when we go to run reports, there's a couple that we run that will literally slow everything down to a crawl. We can't even ring stuff up. And so we've been working with the programmer and the designers of the system to try and get them to work on different things like, cleaning up some of the older stuff and archiving it. But it's interesting because I never thought that limiting a database could give such a benefit to the customers. It's like every once in a while somebody will screw up and run a system that's just run a report that is looking for everything all the time. And it just will kill everything. So you want to limit that database. So moving on a little bit. So the string application pattern was coined by Martin Fowler in 2004, inspired by the vines in Australia. And so he talks about, again, avoiding that tightly coupled architecture. Decoupling leads to independent development and testing of the code. Don't be afraid to change your API and avoid disappearing applications. So as you can see from the picture, Basically, what you would think of is that this first part is your first architecture, your first structure, that monolithic that you built. And it became so entangled, so interdependent on everything else that it couldn't grow anymore. And so with these vines, these strangler vines in Australia, what happens is they start from the outside and they work their way down until they hit the ground and they grow roots. And they strangle, it's beautiful, I mean, it's real pretty, but they strangle the tree underneath it. But basically, you have to do this in your company in order to avoid that initial architecture you built from destroying everything around it. And so you strangle that application and you start building the different APIs around it, and then you can start to grow again. So one of the case studies they brought up in the book was with Blackboard ink. So you can see in 2010 in their graph, that basically what happened, it becomes so difficult for them to commit code, to make changes. They were having such a hard time pushing stuff out because their architecture had become so old, so interdependent, that they were basically going to die. And so they made a bunch of changes, they decoupled a bunch of things, they changed their whole API. They used that strangler method, as we just talked about. And as you can see, they were able to, again, start pushing through code. If you look at the 2010, the code commit started to grow, and then really once they got these changes decoupled and everything done, it became, again, where they were able to keep things going. And Blackboard is just a company that pushes out things to teachers, but it's a great example to look at. So basically, to kind of sum up the chapter, we have a more conclusion slide here, but the architecture dictates deployment. So your architecture is the one top, the predictors of productivity. And I like this quote from the book. It says, to a large extent, the architecture that our services operate within dictates how we test and how we deploy our code. And so you start to realize that you really want to avoid getting stuck. You got to optimize for your organizational goals, and don't be afraid to migrate often. And I think going back to the point of sale system that we currently use at the thing, one of the problems is that they use Crystal reports. And Crystal reports, while it's a very robust reporting system, it's not the most efficient, not the best way to go. I've been able to work with it for a little while. I just realized that it really causes a lot of slowness in the database because it does a search query for everything instead of how it does the structure. And so I encourage them to migrate. And I think that's the issue, is that companies get so stuck on a particular part of their organization, their architecture, that they're afraid to change. They're afraid to step away from that thing. You see that with a lot of companies with their reporting software. There's a lot of different examples, but don't be afraid to migrate. Make your architecture one where it's constantly growing. When Crystal Reports isn't being supported anymore, you go and you find a different, better reporting system, or you build your own. And so you have to be willing to change your architecture, to strangle the old parts if you need to. So let's get into the conclusion slide. So basically, you want that architecture that enables the productivity, testability, and safety. Avoid the monolith, go with the microservices. Learning from Amazon, just making sure that you're constantly looking for ways not to back yourself into a corner. The strangler application, just look for opportunities to kill that old API. I put it behind an API, kill the old structure, the old architecture, and look for ways to grow. Learn from the Blackboard. Really be able to look at opportunities for your company, not to back yourself in a corner where you can't do the code commits, you can't get the changes out of there. Because as we all have learned in the first few chapters, if you can't make those changes, the technology around you is going to continue to grow and you'll die very quickly. And then again, architecture dictates deployment. So structure your architecture in such a way that you're not afraid to make the changes you need to, not afraid to migrate often, look for opportunities to let the company grow. Appreciate this week. It was a good week. Really good to go through everything. Look forward to talking to you guys next week. Thank you.